Hey guys, so we're gonna start. Couple of things. So I uploaded a new case study also for your practice for the exam. The exam date is changed to the weekend, right? This is all announced in the out. The day that was supposed to be the exam, I decided not to run a session, right? So it was gonna have empty slot there. I know you have other exam, and also you can prepare more for the weekend exam. That's it. So let's start with this class. So today we're going to do the chapter 5. I uploaded this chapter 5, so now you could have read it. I think the way to go with the case studies to try to do it on your own, and then go back to this chapter and then kind of corroborate things, right? So a little bit of difference from the case study to this is that there you actually are using a particular utility function called Douglas. So hence some answer is going to be more precise. Okay. And today we're going to see more of a general analysis using graphical devices, but also at the same time trying to figure out what kind of assumptions we're making on preferences will drive the results. In particular, you will see that the part of the budget is pretty much straightforward, right? For that one, there is a straight answer, right? And in the case study, I did start that we use a particular preference so that all answers converge, right? And let's go to this chapter. And then let's go back to this case study later on. So again, summary, new case study, that's for your practice. I'm going to upload the answers after you have tried them. So I think you should try to do that on your own. Yep. Next week we go. Sure. Yeah, so let's see how, I think it's a good idea. That's my plan as well. I want to go over this without caring, right? But yeah, we can make space for that. Yeah. Today is a short class, right? So we're gonna try to do this not running. So we're not gonna finish the chapter, I think. Okay, so supply function for labor and savings. So as I told you in the case study, this is kind of a very important question. Even now, economists are still thinking about this question. Right? This is a kind of classical policy question. Everywhere. And it appears everywhere because as we know, as we discussed in the previous class, any government which is a point where you are thinking about policies trying to target poverty, right? And then one of the classical questions that we have on such kind of policies is what's happening with labor supply, right? So if you go to the history books, as I mentioned, right, one of the first studies of the poorest was done by John Locke, right? So he was of the first liberal thinkers. And in England, especially the way people treated poor was also with this idea, you have to work when you live, right? So that's the idea of the working poor. And you can see that even now translates to today's policies in North America, right? In the US, there is no cash transfer, there is food stamps, and there is minimum wage, right? So the moment you get a job, then you're guaranteed this minimum amount, right? But only if you work, right? And then you may be given some additional aid, but with unlabeled food stamps, right? So you cannot it's not fully fungible. We call that name, essentially you can use this money in anything, right? It's not fungible. So you can see that even these ideas of Locke of the working poor, right? So you can work when you're living, survive today. So countries with less of that particular tradition of thinking, like the Anglo countries, like countries like mine, Ecuador, we are more liberal in terms of actually helping. And so the cash transfers in the rest of the world is kind of a big deal. So if you go to Africa, to Asia, to South America, Central America, there are programs very similar to what you would call now universal basic income, but of course targeted to a certain part of the population. So it's not fully universal, but effectively will cover 60% of the population, right? Which is quite a lot. And what it means is usually you receive a cash transfer in the form of a check, usually now just a bank transfer, right? Then you get it into bank, and there you go. Right? That's one thing. Some countries from that big set of countries, usually non-Anglo tradition, they do two things. They usually either condition the recipients on doing something with the money such that you can keep receiving it in the future, right? And usually the idea is that you should be able to invest this instead of expending it, right? So the idea is, and this is a new form, a little bit of evolution of working for idea, that now you should spend it on human capital. As I mentioned, this is where we appear more and more as we progress in the education economies or adjacent professions. Human capital is this idea of education capital, right? So you invest in becoming a high quality human being, being healthy, being more educated. So the idea is that you don't just eat it, right? You put it towards the future. So many countries, what they do is they tell you, we give you a cash transfer, but we're going to condition. And then finally, the second part of this is, of course, the unconditional cash transfer. We just trust you, okay? So we just trust the household to do whatever is best for you. That's it. We just want to help you reach the consumption of it. Now, again, when you do a policy, it covers like 60% of your population, then you have to be worried about side effects, right? That's the key in anything, right? So there are always side effects. So now this is a little bit an attempt to try to at least pose the problem. I'm not going to give you a solution. This is still a running issue. We don't know the full extent of the reaction of households to receive money that is not related to labor. And as I said, we're going to see today some nuances that really depends on many factors, but of course, in a theoretical analysis such as the one we're going to do today, essentially it depends on the assumptions we make. But what modern economists do is going to basically try to create a theory to try to give you a guidance on what to do. And then once we have posed the problem, then we go to metrics, right? The other class we're taking, experimental income. And then we try to collect data to try to give us feedback to see if our thinking, the theory was right. Okay, and if not, then what should I change or what I'm doing, right? So again, today we live in a modern world, so data is first. So in the 60s, many policies were made on this kind of analysis. Look, if we find a model that is showing that by receiving money, you will stop working, right? Then essentially that was a good enough justification. Now modernly, theory is not first, data is first. So you will have to run usually an experiment. And then in the experiment, this will reveal to you as a policymaker that is actually a technical policy. That's a good case, right? Not all countries are like that, but many are, especially because of the influence of the world. So a lot of these cash transfers are given through bonds, national organizations, and they will basically send technical missions. So economists and you, they will be shipped to different countries to help them implement this policy. Actually, one of my best friends, I used to work with him when I was younger in this same thing. Now he's one of the guys in sending missions to Africa, to the Northern Africa, Southern Africa, Asia. You know, he's essentially helping them to do the same thing we did in Ecuador, right, many years ago. And now places like Uganda, places like Morocco, places like Azerbaijan are doing the same. Okay, so it's kind of an exciting thing. When you do this, a lot of technical work, right? So what I want you to realize is that this is going to be just a small first glimpse in this. So don't expect to answer. It's a big question, okay? And usually a lot of questions will pop up in your head because one thing that is important about knowledge, especially in these times of artificial intelligence, to have perspective. So the idea that you bring your own perspective to knowledge in econ is super important, right? And as I said, right, so we have evolved a lot from the ideas of Locke, the Anglo ideas. So Canada is a way more diverse country than was England when Locke was thinking about these things, right? Centuries ago. So the idea that you have your own unique perspective, bringing it to this big question is super important, okay? So perspective is super important. So try to keep up your minds going towards that. So again, so economically, this problem is kind of simple. We can map it to what we have been doing before. In order to pose down an econ problem, we have to make some simplifications, right? So remember always an econ problem. An econ model is going to be kind of a first sketch of a complex problem. And our idea is to have a sketch that captures enough for what we want, right? So a good example of a model is, of course, a map. So you don't want a map that is fully detailed and tells you every single thing that there is in real world, right? So there was this tale by Borges, the Argentinian writer. And essentially, there's this kind of parody tale where essentially this society builds a map of the city as big as the city itself, right? And as detailed. And then, of course, it's completely useless, right? So a model is always a simplification because we want to see the main details. So the first thing that we're going to make here is essentially that the act of working does not give you any pleasure, right? So we discussed this a bit in the previous class. So the idea is that it's just a means to an end. There is no intrinsic value to it. Okay, first simplification. Now, there are many reasons why we want to make this simplification. First of all, simplicity, right? Because we're going to make our model a true map. So ruling out many behaviors that will change a lot of implications, and also, this will be a better assumption if we knew using data that most of people actually behave like this. I think for many situations, this could be a reasonable assumption. When you do this in real life, you have to ask yourself if this is in fact reasonable, right? So parentheses, if you are trying to do supply for NGOs or volunteering work, for sure this is a bad assumption, right? But if you are trying to think, is this a good assumption for minimum wage work in places like McDonald's? I think it's a good assumption. You see my point? Okay. Now, that's the first assumption we make. With this assumption, essentially, we're going to try also to simplify the world into two groups. Of course, this is usually done mainly for places like this, lecture, or explain to politicians, frankly. Why? Because in real world, there are many more things than just consumption, right? So you have many other options. In particular, for instance, if you are a politician, you may be worried about consumption of goods that society doesn't want people to consume, right? So classical suspects, alcohol, use of drugs, right? That's kind of the usual suspect. So essentially, in a true application you kind of break it into things. I was mentioning more modernly. Remember, we have evolved a lot in terms of poverty analysis. What is the modern thing we're looking at? Consumption of these human capital, right? Consumption of education, right? So you can break this C into more things, but for the purpose of the class, we basically collapse everything that is not leisure into this composite commodity called C. Okay, second is simplification. Now we have C and labor. And now, one issue that we have with labor is, since we simplify the world and make it such that labor is essentially a bad, it's not a good. Right? So you don't derive positive utility from the bad that is working. Hence, we can redefine, and this is a trick you can always do, redefine the bad as a good, right? Which is essentially the absence of the bad. And what is the absence of the bad? Leisure, right? So capital L is going to be the leisure, and this is now going to be defined as this mirror image. So this is actually the case. So for instance, in some of your practice problems, you were asked to draw in different skewers for some things that are bad, right? And then they look weird, right? They happen to be kind of flipped. Also writing utilities for those kind of complex because they involve negative values, right? And then things are messed up. So in general, there is always a way to define from a bad a good, right? That's usually the way. So examples, so for instance, pollution, we all know is a bad, right? So remember you get, for instance, now we got this smoke from the fires from the goods in Canada, right? But that put our air quality in Canada to the same level of cities such as Delhi or New York, Mexico, Mexico City. And so, of course, having bad air quality, especially in places like Mexico, due to human activity, is a bad, right? So, how can you tell me how can we define it as a good? That one's very easy. Any ideas? So, pollution, right, is the bad. Now, I'm having some utility function that, of course, I'm consuming some physical things such as food, and then I'm defining basically the utility with respect to that. So it's kind of something as simple as air quality, right? So good air quality now does the thing consume. And now, of course, there is pollution, and then there is this mirror image. And of course, as you try to consume nicer things, that's going to have to be manufactured, right? It has to be transported. That thing will generate pollution, right? Which will feed back to the lower air quality. Okay. So I'm telling you this because this kind of modeling, right, as you can see, is not something you can do at once. So if you progress in your static economics, you will do it many, many times, right? And so the presence of a bad can always be redefined as a good. Okay, that's the take-home message. Now, so we do that. That's the second trick we do here. And now we have our little simplified world with two goods. And of course, I told you, I don't particularly like the fact that you are basically trapped in a two goods world forever in the intermediate micro. Okay, I don't like that. Probably I'm gonna take you out of that world at some point. But in any case, in these cases, we want to do this because we are helping ourselves with graphical devices. Okay? The graphical devices, of course, limit us to two goods. The important thing about econ, if you didn't notice already, if we deal with one good, all the intuition is gone out of the game, right? So just so the moment we have one good, substitution is gone, complementarity is gone. Remember what you were taught in intro to econ. Utility for one good. Essentially, you have to do everything cardinal, right? Because then the only thing that matters is marginal decreasing utility. Marginal decreasing utility, you know already that has no meaning, right? So the only way we can remove the cardinality and do something is with two goods, because in two goods we have the marginal rate of substitution, which is a division, a ratio, a fraction, right? And fractions are scale-free. So if I scale up the utility by 100, the marginal rate of substitution is not effective. Okay, so I want you to realize that actually two goods is the minimum. Okay, now I'm going to tell you something else for the people that are curious. Two goods are also tricky. Two goods are kind of have a lot of additional structure that you will get here. Essentially, you have only this law of demand, the compensate law of demand we discussed. That's the only implication that we have here. If you move to three goods, new implications will arise. Okay, and the two goods then super special and also yet because I want to ask you guys that those of you that are better with calculus will try to see it in equations, right? So trying to help your logical thinking analysis with the manipulation of math is way more powerful than just graphical analysis, right? Because with the manipulation of the equations, you can then deal easily 3 goods, 4 goods, 100 goods, right? Very easy to scale. Graphical devices, they don't scale, right? All your thinking will be trapped there, okay? So be careful with that. But anyway, we have done this choice. We have 2 goods now, capital L, small c, consumption, composite good, is thing that involves all things that are not leisure, right? And of course, the object of interest, leisure, as the mirror image played. Good. Okay, so now things are getting better. Time to figure out 2 things. So any equal model from the point of view of the decision maker has 2 components, always 2 components. First component is preference, right? We have a preference function. This preference is ranking. Essentially here, we will make a mathematical model. And you know, this part is where you can go full black belt economist level, right? And create your own utility, create your own stuff. You're not to that level yet, right? So I'm not going to ask you to do that now, right? So utility, I'm going to give it, right? I'm going to give you guidance. Throw it. That thing is fixed. So the only thing I can move now, of course, is the budget, right? We were playing in the previous chapters with simple budgets. This is the linear budget constraint. You have a price for good 1, price for good 2, some exogenous income, and then voila, you put it together. P1 times x1 plus P2 times x2 less than or equal to, and that's the budget, always been the budget. When you have monotonicity, this less than or equal to becomes the equality, right? Because you cannot consume below because you want more error. So then there you go, you need the equality. Be careful, guys. Trick question may appear in later classes, unless trick questions. So don't worry with me much. But you know what happens if you have a VAT with a little less than equal budget constraint. Yes. VAT, something that doesn't give you possibility. So something that is the opposite of a good. Yep. So the thing there is that if you have a VAT, then this is not monotone, right? As you increase the quantities, you don't want, right? So you can easily consume inside the budget, right? So what I'm saying is be careful in your minds that the budget constraint always has this less than equal sign, except when everything is right. Now, so in this case, we're gonna break our our constraints, and then we're gonna change the budget to a new thing. The budget is gonna be described to you in words. And usually that happens in real life. So we have, since we're talking about a daily problems, we have to choose kind of a time window to make it more sensible. We're thinking about labor supply in 1 day. Of course, this can be easily changed on, here, but in this case, we choose a day. So now, first constraint, you cannot work forever, right? So there is 24 hours in the day. We're going to have first a capital T defining numbers of hours. Of course, this is simplification. In real life, humans, most of us need to sleep, right? There is a mutation in some people that requires to sleep very little or not at all. That's a very cool kind of genetic mutation. You can Google it. Some people report that they don't even get affected in other cognitive abilities for having that thing. So a very fun thing. Some guy even have a radio show at night. You live twice, right? But in this case, you're imagining this guy because this person doesn't, right? 24 hours, simplification. Now, if you consume capital L hours of leisure, then you subtract from capital T capital L, and you get little l, which is the number of hours that are labeled, right? Yeah, so I'm gonna actually move it to that. So this is the first equation you need from the budget. So this is, of course, the previous budget. Now we're gonna try to write down the new budget. The new budget is formed of two equations. The first of them that I'm describing, a little bit changing the order here, is the second equation that is highlighted. This is little l plus capital L equal to capital. So the total hours you either work or play is equal to 24 hours, right? That's it. There is nothing more in this world. First equation. That's a physical constraint, right? So in many cases, econ problems do have a physical constraint. This is what there is, right? This is an important thing, especially right when you're writing down a model for natural resources. You're gonna get this kind of behavior, right? So for instance, you are fishing in a lake. There's a finite number of fishes, right? There you go. That's the thing you get. That's the total capacity. So this is kind of a total capacity. Now, second thing, that's a little bit the harder one, but it's just from the description of the problem. It tells you, look, here the price of all other goods is P, and then how much you spend on this is the multiplication of P times C. Okay, and then here, as opposed to the previous budget in the previous chapter, you only eat if you work, right? Very Anglo tradition, right? Only eat if you work. So W times U. Okay, there you go. That's the second part of the budget. So we haven't introduced yet this additional part of the problem, that is what happens if you have a non-monetary, non-laboring, right? We're gonna add that later. Now we're just gonna deal with this. Okay, so as I said, now you're faced with two constraints instead of one. Okay, what do you do next? Well, first of all, we have one of the pieces, right? So remember that the preferences are still on the time, yet we know we're gonna stick to our guns, we're gonna do utility maximization, right? Because that's what we know. We have spent some time, invest, increase your human capital to learn the Lagrangian, MRS, you read several chapters, right? That's what you did. That's what you know. Now you have utility maximization. So that's fixed. We're gonna make it more precise. That's fixed. The only thing we're dealing with is the new budget. Okay. So new problem, right? The budget is no longer the same. So what is your reaction, guys? This is no longer interpolation, this is extrapolation. So what do we do? So the first trick is a little bit of an algorithm that I use myself, but many people do, is take a new problem that we haven't seen before, then make it as close as possible as to the thing you know, right? Manipulation of the problem such that it looks like something you already know. Okay? This trick works everywhere, right? So you are faced with a new thing. What is the best scientists, what they do is they try to see manipulations or different perspectives of such a problem that it looks exactly like an old problem. And then when it looks like an old problem, then you use the old tools and fix it, okay? So what is messing with me here? I have two budgets instead of one, right? So then what do I need to do? One budget, right? Okay, let's work through it. Okay, I want to do only one budget. Now, important things if I do that, there are many ways to do one budget. So what is the correct budget? Well, let's think a little bit more. What are the variables? Leisure, capital L, C. Okay. what are the parameters? Capital T, P, and W, right? Parameters are things that don't change. They are given to me, right, as information. I'm going to be solving in the utility maximization problem for optimal values of C and W. Okay? So as a rule of thumb, my one ideal budget will have all the variables or control variables, call it in optimization, on the left-hand side. Okay? And parameters, if there is any left, on the right-hand side. Okay? That's the rule. Usually that's the way we write it. And then we're going to do it. So my trick is, I don't know still how it looks, since the question is there. And imagine this equation as we first phase the case study. I'm just going to manipulate these things. And the way I'm going to do it is essentially, I'm just going to solve for little L in the second highlighted equation. So little L is equal to T minus capital L. I'm going to plug in that in the first inequality, right? So W parentheses, capital T minus L, okay? Distribute W there. And then now just put all the control variables in the left-hand side, W times capital L plus P times C less than or equal to W. And now this thing looks, first of all, it's a single budget, all the information on one. Second, it looks closer to what I have. Okay. Now, importantly, W on capital T, parameters, right? So they are effectively to me like a constant, right? So I don't care. And then left-hand side, W is the price of input under this new input, because it's the opportunity cost of taking an hour in completion, right? So if I stop working on my revisions, on prepping this class, right? I just watch TV, watch Netflix, play some video game, go to the lake, whatever. Then I'm potentially leaving some future wage, right? So my wage, how it works here is it doesn't depend on the hours I work. I get paid monthly, right? But if my future wage depends on my productivity, right? So of course I'm giving up some wage over the city if I go to the lake. Yeah. So that's my opportunity cost. Now P is the price of consumption, right? That's a classical. And then you have less than or equal to W times T. So there you go. Yep. Yep, it's a parameter. It's the price of consumption. No, left-hand side is any expression that contains or is related to control variables. So it doesn't mean that it's a pure expression only containing them, right? It's any expression that involves. So this expression involves C, right? Yep. Yes. Perfect. So left-hand side is a big function, right? That contains the control variables and of course other stuff. And whatever is left, right? Free of the control variables, right? Now, importantly, when you pose this thing, right? It's very important to understand. So here is come the sanity check. So you look at what you derive and you say, does it make sense, right? And I think this equation makes a lot of sense. It's very good. So also you see the power of math. Before we have these two things separated, but now we see a new interpretation of wage as a opportunity cost of issue, right? Cool stuff. And also I see now that my constraint is really given by capital. So a lot of things are coming to my mind, right? So a curious mind can say, look, what happens actually need to sleep, right? So for instance, if I'm forced to sleep like you were kids, right? So parents, I think in Canada, people are super strict with sleeping times, right? Not in Ecuador, but here it's like certain hour, all the toddlers go to sleep, you know, they disappear from the face of Canada, right? So that's what happens. And then, you know, you have a fixed time, right? So you're forced to sleep that time. So that will be a contraction in the budget, right? So if you have to sleep too much, right, because you're related to, then of course you're gonna have a contracted budget. Right? Importantly, the slope of this is of course the ratio of W on T. Now, important thing, you want to do now a graphical analysis. We're gonna make arbitrary choices here. There is no good one or good two. You just pick whatever you want. So we're gonna pick, one of them is gonna be in the vertical axis and one of them is gonna be in the horizontal axis. So again, fully arbitrary, If your exams or your analysis choose whatever way, it's okay. So there is no particular convention here what goes in the vertical versus horizontal, just that you know. Good. So in particular, we're going to choose consumption on the vertical axis and leisure on the horizontal axis. Now, if you want to plot this thing, then now you know, since it's the vertical axis is C, right? If I want to write down the equation of the line that you see there plotted in red, what should I do? Okay, first of all, the line is just the thing that happens with equality, right? First thing to note. The second thing to notice is that I have to solve for isolate for C, right? The moment I isolate for C, then I get the following information. The slope of this red equation is W over D, okay? Of course, if I flip the axis, so now leisure becomes the horizontal thing, then the slope also will flip, right? So what I'm saying is don't take this as face value, right? So it just depends on the perspective. I chose this perspective, no implication whatsoever on real analysis, just an artistic choice. Under this choice, the slope is W over D, okay? Now, importantly, this is telling me that the relative prices that will, in the end, drive the substitution between leisure and consumption will be driven by the ratio of wages to prices. So our intuition will tell us that that makes sense, right? The cool thing about math is that it helps you formalize whatever intuition, okay? Second thing, what about the slope? What I just told you, right? W times capital T divided by E. So that means if I'm forced to sleep, then of course this thing will be less than 24 hours, it will be a contraction, right? Without changing prices or wages, then it will be just a parallel contraction towards the other. Okay? Somehow, you know, if I move to another planet with a different movement around the sun, and I have more hours in the day, then for sure, you know, I have here more time. So that's the only physical. Please, yep. So the only thing I was saying is, so T is 24 hours, right? So now you replace that. Now imagine that you have to sleep 12 hours, right? Go exactly by half, right? Right. Good. So there you go. That's the first part. We draw the budget. Now let's go back to preferences. So as I said, right, the whole point of learning the utility maximization model, preference functions, and so on, is that for the first time ever, you have a model of behavior of consumption, consumers, that you can use, right? You can manipulate. I'm not telling you it's the best one, right? In fact, I have told you many times, this model is kind of shaky, right? So it's kind of, we have gas cars. They are great, they take us places, but they're also very messy. It's the same thing, right? Now, what is cool is that finally we're actually having something that can tell you in a minimal way, right? Remember the idea of the map, complex geographical area. It's a map, right? It's a simplification of the brain. And essentially we're saying this is going to be a ranking, and we're going to be ranking what? Quantities of consumption and leisure. So remember that in fact, this is an infinite consumption space, right? Any infinite, any quantity, for instance, you can have 1.00001 of consumption, right? And leisure, it can be 0.56, whatever. So this is an infinite consumption space of leisure, right? And then we're gonna put it together, and then we're gonna say people have preference over them. And of course, there's two ways to understand preferences given our tools. The first one, of course, is a graphical device. We're going to try to write down what is this famous indifference curve, revealing the rate of substitution through its slope at any point between how much I like consuming versus leisure. And importantly, depending on how you draw this, you're capturing different levels of substitution. So here is, of course, when a great artist will be able to tell you, right? So if these things, for instance, somehow come in conflict with this person, then they will be, you know, this level here with a king. if you really kind of don't care, right, between consuming and leisure, like there will be a line, right? And anything between is this. There are some people that actually don't care about leisure, right? So famous stories, right, about like, for instance, Isaac Newton and John von Neumann and Erdos, Paul Erdos. He was a mathematician that worked all the time. So he went around the world working with people, and basically his leisure was writing math papers, right? Okay, so there are some people like that. For them, leisure does not enter the utility, right? And then it's a simple kind of straight line. So all of these are facts. Now, yeah. So leisure here, the bat is only the label, right? And now you define as a mirror image this leisure that we're assuming always gives you 0 or positive quantities. So that's not only, that's why it defines it as a good. But a good can be basically useless in the sense that it will give you 0. But 0, of course, is a special case, when you're at the same time a good and bad, right? So formally, it doesn't give you. What I'm saying is that this curvature you're drawing there innocently, right, is capturing a lot of information and also is imprecise. So rather mathematical description of this. So like a Cobb-Douglas, the Cobb-Douglas that we did in the previous class has this parameter alpha measuring exactly, right, how much this is the curvature is, and actually telling you how much you like consumption versus leisure. Okay. And anything you choose will have restrictions, right? Because this is completely coming out of your imagination, right? So in real life, it would be great, right? If you go from the study, from the experiment, and are able to elicit the marginal rate of substitution, right, from the data. Now you bring it up, okay? That's the only thing we're skipping here, right? This is an intermediate class. And so here we're throwing just a random thing. Another thing I'm telling you here, guys, is that once I have drawn my preferences, now I have a full model behavior, since I already posed on my budget constraint by maximizing this preference function as captured by the indifference curves here. These are both monotone goods, right? So I'm gonna push it to the very end, or on the optimal consumption is gonna happen on the budget line, on the red line. And then this happens, of course, satisfying the marginal rate of substitution just there. So when you see L star and C star, now have the optimal. So what we did in the previous class, I did on the board. I posed down the Lagrangian, right? I wrote down the utility as a Cobb-Douglas. I added the Lagrangian as a new budget. I derived the 3 partial derivatives, so 3 Fedorov conditions. The first one with respect to X1, so C. The second with respect to L, capital L. The third one as budget. I solved for optimal C star and optimal capital L, right? Giving me, of course, the optimal little L. And that was what you see there, right? Both things are equivalent. They give you this L star. So who remembers what was the L star equation for the Cobb-Douglas in the previous class? Very simple, nice equation. It was 1 minus alpha times capital B, right? So the fraction of total hours in the day multiplied by 1 minus alpha, right? That was the equation for L star. And then consumption dependent, of course, from the rest of parameters. In particular, you consume less of C as price of P went up, but also the W had an impact as increasing the possibilities of I. So it depends directly proportional to that. Okay. So that's all there. You have 2 alternative descriptions of this. As I mentioned many times, my own experience learning the micro has been that graphical devices are really nice, but I, in the end, understand fully use. Up to you guys. Try both. Try whatever makes you happier. In this class, for sure, we're going to be requiring a little bit more of analytical analysis, just on graph. So, importantly, once I have obtained a solution, right? That's the first step, right? So now I have a full map of brain with constraint mapping to actions. Actions are consumption of C star and L star. So now I have a little model of a human, right? That has some preferences for C and L. And now this person is facing budget. And now the important question is what happens when I change the parameter? So remember, this is done in 2 steps. First, I fix the parameters and just have the control variables solving for C and capital F. Once I have obtained the optimal behavior, now I just study how the optimal behavior changes as a change parameter. Okay, and this is the analogous of the previous chapter we saw with substitution and inference. So we're doing the same as before, you see, just in a new fashion. The secret about econ is all this. It will never change. It's all this. So when you go to help econ, same thing. You write down utility, write down constraints, there you go. Macro. Some of you are taking intermediate macro, right? So intermediate macro, same business, right? You have now consumption today, consumption tomorrow. You have a budget. This is a second part of this chapter, by the way. And there you go. Same thing. When you do consumption of national parks like environmental, same trick. The cool thing about econ is always the same trick. It's a unifying framework. Now, may not be the best car, as I said, may not be the best stage, may not be the best map, but these are very flexible. Anything you give me, I can write about. There is a Nobel Prize that wrote basically how people commit crimes versus not using it. Okay, that's Becker. How do you allocate bequest on your kids? That's a love question, right? Not for econ, just substitution among kids. How do you give to charities? That's really about being a noble human being. Yeah, but also for econ, it's about substitution between yourself and the other. Is it? Substitution, complementarity, so all the same. So yeah, this starts super important. Essentially, this is the cornerstone. Okay, but I want you to start thinking like that. So it's not about like learning little snippets, right? And then just repeat it. It's about learning the craft, right? So this is the same thing you do forever. So essentially, I can stop the class here and just give you problems, and then you figure it out. You see? That's sometimes apprenticeships work like that. I tell you, look, I did the first model. This is a little sculpture I did. And look at it, have the knife, you have a year to figure out yourself, right? That's a way to learn, right? So I'm just telling you guys, you should be doing a little bit of that. There is no substitute. Doing it yourself is the only way you're going to learn, right? So manipulating this thing, playing with this toolbox is the only way you're going to learn. Is it useful? Sure. Is the only, so far, mathematical model of behavior of humans we have right now, right? Neurobiology, people working in there, they have a lot of data, a lot of little facts about how people behave. Models are more rare. Econ is one of the few sciences in social science and human-related sciences that has actually a working model that in many cases works very nice. Okay? So you have to really see the value of that. And when you can really go deep and see what it means to have at least some working mathematical device that can, in principle, at least tell you something about how people choose. Okay? So, and this is very, very good. As I said, questions about altruism, questions about love, marriage market, questions about, you know, not only finance, not only things that many people consider. This goes way deep. Okay? Very, very good. Okay? So that also means I have basically infinite ideas for case studies, as there are infinite papers in econ using this little toolbox for many problems under the sun. Okay? And of course, one of them is the case study I send you with a little paper attached. If you're curious enough to give that a look, we'll discuss that later. Okay? But now, let's go with this. So as I said, the algorithm is this. Using my model, I obtained optimal consumptions or rational choices, or utility maximizing choices of C star L capital S. Next step, and always next step, now it's time to change the parameters, but looking its effect on the optimal choices, only on the utility maximizing choices. Okay? That's the only ones I care now. You see? So they are always maximizing with respect to the change of parameters. So that thing will not change. So now, so C star is of course a function of W, capital T. Why capital T disappeared? Because capital T is 24 hours, we're not going to change it for now, right? So for simplicity, now it's just a function of the two prices. So there you go. Now the same thing with leisure. And of course, little l is capital T minus optimal leisure. So now you have all the model here. And this is an important object. The labor supply is in fact L star the wage, right? Now you can see here that that only is true if I fix the price of the other goods to 1, okay? Otherwise, it also has to depend on the price of it, okay? Yet again, another instance of why intro to economics is kind of deceptive, right? Because in reality, for real econ, you need substitution. So it's all about two goods, at least 2 dimensions. And of course, I told you, even 2 dimensions can be free with high things, okay? So there you go. Labor supply, as maybe you learned it in economics, is not just a function of wage, right? It's also a function of the prices of the other. And obviously, without that, the picture is not full, right? Think about this case. So, as I said, as Canadians, we're facing inflation, right? So inflation of goods that we eat, right? Many of them. That's the CPI, consumer price index. Okay. So what happens in this little model if prices of food goes up, right? And then wages, they remain stagnant, right? They're the same. So what happens with the slope? So first of all, you have a change on the slope, right? So W over P, right? So since P is larger, what happens? So the denominator is larger. The slope is steeper. But remember, what we were talking about in the previous chapter, what happens when they change price? There is a side effect on the income, right? So there you go. You have to plot again the full income, right? The slope is divided by P, right? So as P is larger, you get poorer, right? Less of everything. So now you are going to consume less leisure in most preferences. In most preferences, depends a lot on the preference, but in most preferences, it will happen that because now you're poor, right? So people have to work harder because prices are higher, right? There is no labor supply without this opportunity cost and the other dimensions. So I'm just calling your attention to this. It's important that if you learn anything from intermediate micro, is that it's all about tools, because it's all about substitution. Okay. Remember, that's the only way we can think ordinary. Yeah. So you can do it. You have 3 goods. Essentially, you cannot visualize the utility, but you can visualize the indifferent surfaces. And indifferent surface would be a 3D plot, right? Because, but they will be only the different surfaces, right? So many people stop plotting a 2, right? And then for the rest of goods, we just use mathematical. And that's what I was saying. So one idea I also want you to learn in this class is the idea of the scalability, right? So things that are worth learning are things you can scale up, right? So for instance, programming is good because you go learn a little loop, right? You say, hi world, right? Hello world, like that. And then after the loop, you're writing an app, right? So it's very easy to scale. Econ is a little bit like that. So you have these little equations, right? And then you can build it more and more complex, do it for 2 goods, 100 goods, do it for crime, do it for the analysis of marriage market, blah, blah. So you can basically blow it up if you want, okay? So things that are scalable are powerful. Drawing is not a scalable skill, right? Because anytime the analysis goes beyond 2 goods, you're gonna do it, right? So great question, thank you. Now, so as I said, we're gonna analyze this particular thing that is the effects on, of course, our optimal choices as I change the parameters, so W and P. So, for instance, how does the wage rate W affects the consumer desired consumption of leisure and his decision about how much time to spend working? So obviously, you might think that this discussion should be an easy application of what we learned already, but as W goes up, the consumer wants less leisure and wants to supply more labor. However, the analysis we do now is different and is slightly more complicated. And again, it's because now we're ordinal and we have two goods instead of just this simple one-dimensional thing. And so in particular, we're gonna compare this with the previous chapter equation. So in the previous one, the M there basically doesn't depend on this W, right? So M is an exogenous object that was basically a check that you have, free of labor. And now instead, it depends on W, right? So as you can see, the effect of W now is double, right? Because it's also changing this part of the right-hand side of the budget. So the reason that we do now is not an obvious and simple extension of chapter 3. So the analysis as W changes, both the left-hand side and the right-hand side are changing. So now we can proceed. Okay, so the first thing we're gonna see graphically, and again, we can do this also in the Cobb-Douglas that we were also dealing in the case study. So we're gonna study this substitution effect. So as the wage raises, the consumer will substitute consumption for leisure. This person will want to consume more and spend less time at leisure, time at work. So as you can see here, given this particular difference curves I drawn, we have to plot the new budget as the new wage changes. So there are two changes in this new plot. So you see that the slope is changing, right? Because the slope depends on W prime. So that is essentially a change from W prime to W is a change in the slope. And also there is a change in the intercept, the vertical. And also there is a change in the slope. You can see here that there is a new optimal value that is gonna switch from L star C star to the new object that is L C star. So in this particular case, the substitution effect on the demand for leisure of the supply of labor, the consumer wants less leisure, is the substitution effect, and he wants to work more hours. So remember that we can also separate these effects on the income effect, if you want, analogous to the previous chapter, by doing this analysis of the hypothetical budget, which is in the dashed line. And the idea of the hypothetical budget on the dashed line, right, is that it's keeping the original boundary just the formula. And this is the famous closed compensation, right? So now we get yourself this little separation of the effects. So the isolated effect that we want, which is the substitution effect, is that you have this difference of leisure L prime minus L star from the original situation is less than 0. So it's a negative impact, and this person wants to work more hours, the substitution effect here for the other case. So there you go. So this is the first part. Now, alternatively, if you derive the Cobb-Douglas equations as I did in the previous class, right, we can go and take derivatives with respect to wage, right? Now, here we saw in the previous class that the optimal value for leisure was 1 minus alpha of just capital. So as I derived that with respect to W, what was our surprise? That if you do that, so let me remind you. So under a Cobb-Douglas, in the case study, the optimal value of leisure was 1 minus alpha capital. Okay? So an alternative way of trying to study the impact on wages of this thing, right, essentially is taking the derivative with respect to W. But for the Cobb-Douglas, and only for the Cobb-Douglas, this is just equal to 0. Okay? So this means, right, that the effects we're getting here on the figure are fully dependent on the particular shape of the preference problem, right? So, of course, the Cobb-Douglas is one of the utility functions that have certain curvature that is almost linear in the sense of alpha. So, if you are missing this effect of W, it's because of the use of Cobb-Douglas. Okay? So, the only thing I'm telling you guys is that here I'm just teaching you an instance of a particular impact, but it will depend fully on the shape of the indifference curves. Equivalently, it will depend fully on the parametric choice I make of the preference. In this case, the Cobb-Douglas. So if I choose instead a CES, constant elasticity of substitution, remember the other one would be C1 C to the R plus L to the R, right? then substitution will be richer, right? And then I will obtain a different equation that potentially. Again, in real life, this is a conundrum, right? Because under some utilities, what do? You get no effect on income, right? On the issue, right? So this is an important discussion. So I was saying this to the other class. We will write this, I got this question, and they were quite surprised that under the top Douglas, you get no impact of the wage whatsoever. Because essentially, your supply of leisure is a constant share of the total time. Okay? So what's up with that? Because that means essentially, remember in this world of cash transfers, that they go and give you a check, right? Then your labor supply won't really change at all, right? So that's the issue with theory, right? So essentially, you have two potential theories. One of them, like growing, where the consumption of leisure is reactive, so it changes in a measurable quantity, expected changes in W. And the Cobb-Douglas, that doesn't, right? All depends on the MRS, the degree of the MRS. So now you see that in real life, the important thing is to measure the MRS, right? That's the way you will solve this problem. You have to go to the field, collect some data, use some metrics, then get the MRS. Once you get the MRS, now you can go back and log in and do the analysis. Okay? So take this not as a descriptive of the reality, take it more as this is how I will do my analysis. If the preferences drawn in blue were like this, but the preference drawn in blue, we have to come from somewhere, right? And this somewhere has to be data, always data. Okay, is that clear? Good. So summary, the actual effect on this will depend fully on the schedule. Okay, good. Now, remember these ideas of normal good versus inferior good. So if leisure was a normal good, as the wage raises, the consumer will want to consume more leisure. That is, as W rises, the substitution effect says consume less leisure, the income effect will say consume less. This is because the right-hand side of the budget has W as well. Okay, the net effect that we care of an increase in W will therefore be ambiguous. When it's theoretically ambiguous, then it means that by the same token, the net effect on the consumer amount of work L will be ambiguous. So that's an important thing. Remember this old question, right? So what happens if I change the wage? And this is happening now, right? So there was a point where few people were working, especially young men. Statistically, less young men were entering the job force. And I believe the question is, what to do about it. I think the answer that you will get in social media is just raise wages, right? But you see clearly here that the answer, theoretically, using our little model of the brain, is very ambiguous, right? We don't know. Okay. So that's a cool thing because then we know, look, turns out, using our little model, right, that we cannot do anything. So then you should ask me. So then what is the model good for, right? If you're just telling me, well, the only answer is I don't know. But the cool thing about this model is that, yes, it's not telling you a full closed answer, but it's telling you a lot of important things. It's telling you, look, in the end, it's about two effects that are competing, right? Substitution effect versus income, right? And it's also about the preferences, right? So the MRS. So now, if you get yourself your MRS, you measure it in real life. If you measure the extent of substitution effect versus the income, you elicit this from data, now you get your answer, right? Because then you can see which one is. So the other role of theory is actually giving you objects that before didn't exist. So preferences didn't exist in your mind, now they do, right? The marginal rate of substitution is a new concept now you can define, right? The substitution effect versus the income effect is also a new concept. All of those things didn't exist before this theory. Now they exist. When they become an object that we can think of, we can also measure it, right? And that moment, theory became useful. Because now these are objects you can go and measure it in the field and now get it quantitative. Okay? That's the power of economics. We can not only argue in the air, we can create measurable, quantifiable objects. We then go to the field, collect them, put signs, put numbers into it, see which one is moving. There you go. That's why it is so successful. Okay, very powerful. Good. So, so there you go. That's a paper some of you may write if you're interested. Why young male are not joining the job force as before? What can we do about it? It's an important question, right? Things have changed a lot, especially for a segment of the population. They don't want to work in, right? Why is that? So here you go a little model. Of course, you can think should be popping in your heads, other aspects I'm not getting, right? And certainly Locke and the guys writing this in the 60s didn't get, right? So for instance, one thing that didn't exist at that time, video games, social media, right? So all of that is a kind of cool thing. So trying to come up with a cool model of video game use versus work labor and so on. And I'm over time, sorry guys.